Yeah, okay. So, well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's really great. I followed the cost action that funds this training school, and I know you guys from many different collaborations, and I'm very happy to actually be part of the trainers in this training school. So, I'd like to, first of all, start giving an overview of, and by the way, I understand that this is how you proceeded until now, so everyone can ask after like 20 minutes. But if anything is unclear, of course, like feel free to stop me and I'll try to help everyone to catch up. I developed this kind of presentation, which is, I hope, friendly to everyone. So for those of you who are less familiar with applied statistics, and also to those of you who are more proficient, I think there's a little bit of everything for you, both types of profiles. But anyway, if there's something unclear, feel free to stop me anytime, okay? So this is how I thought that we could discuss today how to model and how to work with contextual factors in migration research using surveys and more generally quantitative data. I will also speak about registers at some point, so it will not only be about, sorry, this is my WhatsApp. For some reason it is still connected. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I'll start by discussing or introducing a little bit how I see the role of context in migration research, generally speaking. Then I will review the importance of properly modeling context. Why is it important to do so, both from the statistical point of view and also from the substantive point of view, of course. And then I will cover different ways the literature uses to approach context in quantitative research, and I'll give a little overview for each of them. But then I will also give an applied example or a real life example in this case using data that I myself produced or data that I work with in different countries and for different topics, so using different dependent variables. Let me start then with this first block. I'll first cover why the role of context in migration research is important and how the literature has generally used it. We come from a very clear tradition in migration research, and after a few years studying migration, I am more and more skeptical about the idea that we should become experts in migration. I think that migration is less specific as a social process than any other process we can think of, and that most of what happens in migration, this is my own personal view, has to do more with the specific dependent variables that we analyze. So my view is that if you're studying education and migration, you should really become an expert in education and not necessarily in migration, or not as much as in migration than in education. And so we come from a very clear tradition in migration research. I think that as migration scholars, we tend to believe that migration is a transforming experience, and that it is a transforming experience in every possible way we can think of. And this is why we become experts in migration. I myself tried to become one. We tend to think that migration changes the way people perceive the world. We tend to think also that migration is such a shocking experience that actually transforms people that migrate. So migrants are different after migration than they were before, compared to how they were before. And we also think very commonly that migration, or the behavior of migrants, is very much shaped by the context of reception. There's this whole literature on segregation, concentration, and the effects that it has on migrants, and eventually also on natives. So all these kind of questions or these kind of approaches to studying migration actually suggests that the context in which migrants emigrate and in which migrants integrate is actually important. And the idea that the context is the key independent variables behind most of the research that we are actually producing these days or over the last decades in migration research. I think this is true generally speaking, but it's specifically true for integration research. Let me cover these three different statements first. So, does migration change the way we perceive the world? Unless we actually look specifically at the context in which migration happens, we might not be able to actually fully show whether this is the case or not. Have a look, for instance, at this first plot. This is data from a project I've been involved in, and I will use different points of my presentation data from this project. It is a project in which educational migrants in China and in different destination countries, specifically in this case, Germany, the UK, and Japan, express views about how proud they are of being Chinese or how proud they are of being from China. And we can think that migrants adjust their views about reality, about the world they belong to, or their countries of origin in this case. But if you really compare how the distribution of this variable is, this is a synthetic index, no, of national pride made of different items. You can actually see that migrants in different countries from China are very similar to people who actually stay in China. Right? So it might not really be the case that migration is such a transforming experience if you properly compare how migrants feel to those who didn't migrate and share with them the same origin. This is one of the items that we used for this synthetic index of national pride. So this is how proud you are about Chinese history. And as you can see, well, you probably cannot see very clearly, but you will when you get the slides. Chinese people in the UK, Germany, Chinese people in China, and Chinese people in Japan are just as likely to be proud of Chinese history when they have a bad or a negative idea about Chinese history, when they are like average, or when they are more inclined to be proud of Chinese history. So migrants are not so different. There are cases in which there are specific items in which they might be a bit different. This is just the same kind of item than the one I used before regarding history, but this one refers to democracy. And what you can see here is that eventually, yes, there is some space to say that people are less satisfied or less proud of China democracy in China when they live abroad. So this is the UK, this is Germany, and this is Japan, than when they live in China. So yes, there is some space to argue that, okay, migration might transform you, but these kind of arguments doesn't really help, doesn't really rule out the possibility that it's not context of reception, that Chinese migrants learn about democracy and then they evaluate democracy in China, but it doesn't rule out the possibility that those who migrate are already more skeptical about democracy in China, right? So we really need to develop arguments to actually make the strong statement that we were making at the beginning of this set of slides, meaning that really migrations change the way people perceive the world. We also tend to think that migration is a shocking experience that transforms the way migrants see themselves, or how migrants actually behave and live, right? Think, for instance, about this kind of evidence. This is evidence. Amparo González, who I think was like in the training school just before me, data that we, Amparo and I, produced for Spain. These are the children of Ecuadorian migrants in Spain, and then the children of native families in Spain, specifically in Madrid, more so than in Spain. And it actually measures mental well-being. So it's a synthetic index of mental well-being, and what we can see is that natives have a higher average in this kind of battery of in this kind of indexes, in this set of questions that actually measure mental well-being than the children of Ecuadorian migrants, that there is some sort of like penalty or that migrants are worse off, the children of these migrant families are worse off when we measure their mental well-being, right? So the idea, eventually everyone would think, okay, this is probably discrimination operating in the context in which the children are. But then if you actually look at this is just, this first plot is the same I was just introducing in my previous slide. This is how different children of all kinds, so migrants and natives, are when their parents never separated from them for a period that lasted longer or more than 3 months. And this is how these children behave when it is the case that both for migrants and for natives, parents and children stayed apart, so separated physically from each other for at least a period of 3 months. And if you can compare these two plots, they're pretty similar, right? So it might be the case that our first intuition is that, oh, this is the context operating against migrant children and probably discriminating or creating some sort of like annoyance that actually they reflect in terms of being less happy. But then, unless you can rule out other possibilities, you might inflate a little bit too much the effect of context. And finally, I was arguing that I tend to see in the literature the idea that migrants' behavior is very much shaped by the context of reception, and that's like very connected to the literature on segregation and concentration. The idea that segregation shrinks opportunities is a very widespread statement in migration research. And one of the fields of research in which we can actually explore whether this is really the case or not is the impact of school concentration of migrants and how this is negatively affecting the performance of migrants as themselves, right? When they concentrate, because of different processes that actually led them to cluster in specific schools, their overall level of attainment decreases, right? So these are two plots. They are equivalent, and it shows how concentrated migrants are in schools in Spain. There are many schools in which there are no migrants, and then there's like a big deal. I mean, certainly an important amount of schools in which migrants concentrate, and then a minority of schools in which they concentrate heavily. And if you actually see how damaging concentration is, you can clearly see that it is significantly bad. So it is a negative predictor for students who are the least successful, so the 10 students that are in the 10th quantile of performance. This would be like students who are less successful, but even for them, regardless of whether they are natives or migrants, concentration is negative. For students that are average or median, this is the 50th quantile of performance, and very specifically for students who are the most successful. So for the brightest students, concentration is the more damaging contextual variable, or at least a more damaging contextual variable than it is for students in other points of the distribution of success. But then when you properly control for context, and you actually try to model not only how bad context is as at the bivariate level for performance, but when you really manage to actually complete the specification of your equation, or when you find ways of really showing who goes to which school, and you actually try to be ambitious and successful in controlling or in modeling the effect of context, what you get is a different idea. No, like it's not really the concentration of migrants, but it's essentially the concentration of poverty in those schools where migrants concentrate that actually explains these otherwise traumatic image. No? So In some, I mean, it's really important to refine your research on migration, being really as careful as you can when you are modeling concentration. Concentration, both as an independent variable, so when you really want to say, or when you really want to attribute causality to context, trying to study migration or the behavior of migrants, but also when you want to use other kind of independent variables, but you really need to properly control for context, right? That was what I was trying to show in these first examples. So this links to my first comment. So the more you study context, the more you realize that a large part of what we as migration scholars tend to attribute to migrants causally is either a composition effect, there is selection into different contexts, or a selection bias. So migrants from different contexts or migrating to different contexts are not just as other people. They are different from those who decide not to migrate or not to migrate to the specific context that we are studying. And it's not always easy to get rid of these two annoying effects, composition effects and selection bias. It's not always easy to do so, particularly if you work with surveys, particularly if you work in the context of this kind of methodological nationalism that we suffer in migration research. Now, we tend to have like migrants in samples of natives. We identify them in samples of natives in statistical operations that represented populations in destination. We most of the times lack information about how different these migrants are for those guys in origin who didn't migrate it, or how different they are when they cluster in different schools or in hospitals or in regions and not in others. No? So it's not always easy to actually get rid of this kind of annoying variation that may actually lead us to make stronger statements than what we should actually do, or than we should ideally do. So this brings me to the importance of modeling context. To get rid of these two effects, so composition effects and selection bias, and to be able to actually make claims about context or about any independent variable that is not contextual but should be controlled for context. So in order to identify micro-level interactions, which we enjoy so much in migration research, like, contact hypothesis or segregation effect, enclaves, like this idea that people interact with each other at the micro-level in specific settings in the settings in which they are embedded. And this explains why migrants behave this way or another. We have to be ambitious, and we have to be proficient in modeling context. And we have, of course, this may sound a bit redundant or even like too intuitive, but we have to actually make a strong argument, theoretical argument. We have to be clear about where our theory places context. Is context a control, or is context the explanation? And how are we measuring context? Are we measuring context as aggregation of level 1 or of individual level attributes, or are we measuring context using some institutional factor that is constant for individuals within the cluster we are studying? So everything having to do with the explanatory status of our independent variables has to be clear since the beginning, and then we have to adjust to the kind of data that we have. This is what I'm going to show in my next slides. Of course, the most wanted, or the best setting in which we can conduct our research on context is the case in which clustering is at the heart of our sampling strategy, or the sampling strategy that was done to produce our data set. No? And this is the case in which we can use hierarchical models, multi-level models of different kinds, the family of multi-level modeling in general. So this will allow you to show not only between cluster variation, between country, between region, between neighborhood, between schools, between hospitals variation, but also within clusters variation. Alternatively, sometimes we have to actually expand our individual level data sets, creating contextual variables that will actually, or variables at the context, at the aggregate level, that will help us to model the effect of context. No, so we may not have like a clear-cut way of identifying individuals in different contexts, but we can nonetheless do part of the job by looking at like artificially built contextual variables that we can use to then make claims conditional on these controls about context. And then there is a third possibility. Sometimes it's not even possible to do so. Sometimes we don't see context, or we have like no clue of how to model context. But this happens particularly in the cases in which we need to control for contextual variables in origin. And in these cases, we have some ways of solving partially the problem, no? Instrumental variable estimation, or quasi-experimental research methods, treatment effects. I'll try to cover these three different possibilities, but most certainly I will cover the first two. Okay, so let's start playing with some examples. This is one of these settings in which you have like a strong contextual effects. So this is PISA data from the OECD. In red you have like the school average in performance. So this is the average performance in mathematics for students within, between schools in PISA data, and the blue points, the blue dots are like students. So this is the kind of context in which you have like a strong incentive to actually invest a lot of time in studying the context in which you operate. Of course, it is always possible to ignore clusters. So it is always possible to conduct your analysis at the individual level and ignore the context. But then in these cases, you will confront two types of problems. First of all, you will confront technical problems. You will have underestimated standard errors, and your contrasts will be unreliable. And as a consequence of that, you will be exposed to a higher risk of having misleading conclusions, or showing or supporting misleading conclusions. No, you may actually be accepting effects that are spurious as if they were empirically valid. Okay, so why? The reason is that, of course, observations within each of these clusters, so think, for instance, of students within the same school, are not fully independent of each other. They are depending on each other to some extent, because they are sharing the same learning context. They are exposed to the same amount of school resources that their common school provides. And when these errors are not independent from each other within each cluster, then we have all these problems that I was just mentioning. Your standard errors will be biased. You will underestimate them, and you will be more likely of committing type 1 errors, no? And accepting effects as valid when they are in fact spurious. But you will also be risking the effect of committing conceptual errors of different kinds. One of the most important, of course, is different types of fallacies, like the atomistic fallacy or Simpson paradox or the ecological fallacy, which is well-known, and which is probably the most known of each of these different fallacies. So it's just like the possibility that you may have like two schools that behave this way. So one will behave as the red line and the blue line is showing. So as your independent variable x increases, your performance will increase. There's a positive correlation. But there's a different school that is actually on average less successful, but shows the same positive correlation between x and y. If you don't take into consideration the context, you may end up saying that this correlation is negative, as the dashed line shows, instead of positive as the green line shows. You will also simplify reality. So this is how parental education and performance in mathematics happens to be associated to each other in different schools in PISA. It's actually a mess. But generally speaking, it's true that there is a positive correlation. So schools in which there is a higher concentration of parental education are more successful. But this is what you will see in your one level or level 1 OLS individual level regression, right? So you will expose yourself to the risk of committing different types of fallacies, but you will also oversimplify reality. So, of course, my advice is that we should never ignore context, and we should, of course, never ignore individual level in our migration research. Let me put this more into like real numbers and a more applied example. So this is an example of a sample of 102 schools. The unit of analysis here is a school. So I have 51 schools in one region, and 51 schools in another region. So these two happen to be schools from two different regions, in one that is known for being very successful educationally, which is Castilla y León. It's a region in the north of the country, and one which is known for being less successful than the average, and it's Andalusia in the south of Spain. And let's see how we can deal with this contextual kind of like settings that I was developing like from a more abstract point of view. So this is a regression analysis, very simple regression analysis. So we have like the mean performance of these schools in mathematics is just predicted by ISCET, so parental education, the average level of parental education in these two schools. We are restricting the analysis to these two schools, but we are estimating them jointly. There's nothing here in this model that actually reflects whether one school belongs to one or the other region, so they are pulled together. You can see here that the number of cases is 102, 51 and 51. There is a positive effect of parental education, and there is a positive, like, well, as expected, constant variable, and these two effects are significant. Okay, so this sounds good. If we only see this, we may think like, oh, we did a good job. Like we estimated a proper, like a convincing effect of parental education on mathematics, on performance in mathematics. And just to show whether this is the case, you can actually check on your residuals, and you will see that they are on average 0. So you don't have any like annoyance that you should, or there's no sign of alert. It's okay. We are like fulfilling the requirements of regression. Residuals are apparently randomly distributed, as I will show now, with an average of 0. This will then be like, in principle, a good modeling strategy. But if we look at the residuals of these two regions separately, so we first look at Andalusia, or this region number 1, which is known to underperform the average, and the other region, Castilla in the north, which is known for overachieving, or like achieving above the average, what you will see is that it is not the case. Residuals are like not distributed with an average of 0 within each of these two regions, right? So we will have like a region in which on average residuals are have a mean value of minus 3.6 or 3.4. And then another region, the other one, in which residuals are distributed with a positive average, so 0.4. Let's see this graphically. Well, let's try to see what we do when we ignore context. Okay, so this is the distribution of our residuals across different levels of school, levels of parental education, right? So this is my independent variables. These are the standardized residuals, and as you can see, or just stop me if you don't. These residuals seem to be like randomly distributed with an average of 0, right? So in principle, if we are not very aware of the context, we would be like, okay, this is the average 0, and there's like as many residuals on top of the average than that is below. And indeed, the cloud is kind of like full everywhere. So there's like a random distribution of these observations. But then we might like see how different the schools in one region or another are compared to each other. So in blue, you have the dots, the observations, the residuals corresponding to one of the regions. And in red, you have the residuals corresponding to the other region. And I mean, I don't know how you see that, but it's clear that they are not like randomly distributed between these two, like different regions, right? There's a pattern according to which probably the red triangles are clustering preferably here, so below 0, and there's like a tendency, it's less clear to see that that shows that blue dots are preferably concentrated below 0. And it's actually
below. You said that, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, below. So this is below, yeah, exactly, below. So preferably schools in this like other region are clustering below 0 in the other region, or like at least in the red triangles are preferably clustering or being distributed across this space of the plot, and the negative parts of it are in preference occupied by like blue dots, right? And you can confirm that if you draw a line and plot whether it is the case. So one of the regions shows a significant trend of placing residuals below 0, and the other one behaves just the opposite, right? It shows a very systematic trend according to which residuals are distributed above this average line of 0. So how can we deal with this problem? How can we actually get rid of this annoyance that we will create to ourselves if we ignore context? Okay, first of all, I will, of course, this is not an exhaustive way of or this is not like an exhaustive, it's not a complete list of solutions, but I will discuss with you like 5 different solutions to this problem. Okay. The first one will be to estimate different models for different contexts. So I will show you an example of how returns to human capital among migrants is in 3 different countries, estimating different models. One country will be France, the other one will be the UK, and the other one will be Spain. This will help us to solve this kind of hidden difficulty that we can confront unless we are not very aware of how important contextual information is in our migration research. Then I will invite you to think of a second solution, which has to do with using dummies as fixed effects. So pulling all the data together and then modeling the effect of context using dummy variables. So one dummy will be one country, one dummy will be another, and there will be a reference that we will use for setting the comparison. And I will present an example of mental health among educational migrants using my data from China, the one that I mentioned before. A third solution could be to control for contextual independent variables. So you may not need to really actually introduce your dummies or to separate your models or to your data or to like estimate separate models. You can eventually be happy, depending on the kind of research question that you have, by simply controlling for contextual independent variables. This will absorb part of the effect that will otherwise be sent to the residuals, right? And I will show you an example of how this can be done using data on babies' health, comparing migrants from Ecuador and natives in Spain, as well as natives in Ecuador. So there will be a triangular comparison. The fourth comparison is to actually run a proper fixed effect model. So this is like a more synthetic solution to the previous ones. I will show you an example discussing issues having to do with how migrants choose destinations. So which is the contextual characteristics that attracts migrants of different kinds, and I will concentrate on highly skilled migrants preferably in that specific example. And I will finally show you probably the most sophisticated way of modeling context, which is hierarchical linear models. I will use an example of using a different source of Chinese data, which is the China Family Panel study, how people choose whether or not to migrate for their education. And I will use regions in China as clusters. So this is what remains for the rest of the sessions, like covering these 5 different solutions with these 5 different examples that will actually reproduce each of these solutions that I gave to the problem that I just presented in this first part of the session. So I'm happy to actually answer questions. I see that I have like 2 questions here, or one of them is from Marisol Escobar. But then, of course, anyone who wants to ask for clarifications regarding this first part of the lecture, I'll be happy to answer. Yeah, so mental well-being. Marisol Escobar, how do you mean with mental well-being? How do you measure it? That's the question. And then Amy Kelly is also asking, could you provide the site for the work on mental well-being you discussed? I will provide you not only the citation, but I will provide you the slides, so you will get my own view on how this is done. So I will speak more in detail about how I measure mental well-being. I'm going to give you a detailed example, and I think it's interesting that you are reacting to my presentation, asking about this specific dependent variable. I think it's one of the most promising dependent variables in integration research, which is not often fully understood by sociologists and demographers. No. So there are different epidemiological scales for measuring mental well-being. I am particularly using in the surveys that I work with or in the surveys that I am producing, and this covers both the survey that I did in China and as well as the survey that I did in Madrid with Amparo Gonzalez on Ecuadorian children or the children of Ecuadorian families. We're using the Kessler 7, K7 scale. It is a very established epidemiological instrument for measuring psychiatric morbidity. So it's not about pathologies, but the likelihood of developing some sort of distress, right? And there's much discussion about whether it measures like the distress or well-being. That I think these two aspects are mirrors. Are like equivalent, like opposites to each other. So, but I will develop this in the second part of my presentation. Okay, so Fatima Buxis is asking, I deal with subjective well-being and it's difficult to define the measurement tools. I do agree, and Fatima, I have to tell you, I externalized the responsibility to social epidemiologists, and Kessler 7, I mean, there's like different combinations and different versions of Kessler scales. K7 is one of the most synthetic ones that I think it's very handy for like people like you who are interested in developing surveys with migrants. No, it's also it's been contrasted in different cultural settings, and with some exceptions, it seems to actually capture the same kind of processes, this psychiatric morbidity in different settings. And then Piotr, so long I didn't talk to you. I'm happy to see you around. I was wondering if you are aware of any ways of measuring integration policies at the regional or local level. So I'm not speaking specifically about this substantive topic, but there's one solution that I think is the one that would generally be appropriate for studying the importance of synthetic indexes of integration into quantitative research. Okay, and it's actually the fourth example. Sorry, yeah, the fourth example. But anyway, and this doesn't really relate to my presentation today. I tend to believe that integration policies are, so when you do contextual research on migration, or you explore the importance of context on migration and the behavior of migrants, I'm afraid that integration policies are like of little importance. I mean, and this is my own personal view, but I tend to, sorry, I was distracted by another question that popped up in the chat. But I tend to think that integration policies are important, of course, but are particularly important to let everyone know how to deal with diversity more than to help migrants integrate. So you tend to see like that the effect of integration policies in terms of contribution to the explained variance is not really very significant, or it's not very huge. And then Tamar and Marisol I will develop this point on mental well-being in a second. Okay, I will be like more detailed, and I'll be. I mean, I'm glad to actually talk to you about. For those of you who are studying like sociologists or the who are studying or starting a thesis on migration, or for anyone who is like trying to develop a survey targeting the migrant population, I would invite you to actually look at these scales. They're very promising. This is a very promising, I think, field of research, and these scales of mental well-being, both for children and for adults, are considered like prerequisites for successful integration, and this applies to dependent variables of different kinds. Okay. So I'll just take a minute because I see that there are like okay, so Paul, exactly. Paul is asking, do I understand correctly that econometrically speaking, by contextual issues, you mean error terms are not normally distributed and are autocorrelated, and the model is not well specified, hence by introducing the right control variables, these contexts are taken into account? Yes, this is part of what I meant. I think that there are different solutions to this kind of problem. They, I would say, are nicely summarized in these 5 different solutions, which, as I said before, are not like, it's not an exhaustive, a complete list probably of the possible solutions. Okay. And then I have a final question by Gabriela and Yuelu. Great. So that makes it for Paul. I mean, Paul, just in the meantime, until everyone gets their questions written, what I'm saying is that this is the kind of problems that you confront when you ignore context. So, of course, there are like many other problems, but one of them is clearly this specific one. No? If we have like a pool of, like, say, migrants across different regions, and think, for instance, that some regions are able to attract more highly skilled migrants, or like migrants that are positively selected for some reason compared to other regions, and you ignore regional variation in the distribution of migration or in the distribution of migrants by this kind of characteristics, then you may end up like having this kind of problems, which are problems that actually bias your results, no? And like put at risk the contrast that you might be selling to your audience. So Santi, should I wait, or is it like a?
No, you can go ahead.
Here it is, Gabriela. I'm curious on the mental well-being case too. The gap of mental well-being between children who were separated from their parents to those who weren't, if you separate the natives and the migrant groups, is the same way you look. Yeah, exactly. So Gabriela is asking about, I'm going to go back just to answer her properly, because I will not cover this example anymore. But I'm glad that this issue of mental well-being gets this kind of attraction. So Gabriela, this is indeed what you observe when you like, this is raw data, right? There's no cooking behind it. So it's really like how you actually calculate this index and you compare migrants and natives, and what you see is that there is a 15% penalty in the distribution of the subjective dimension of well-being when you compare the children of Ecuadorian families and the children of Spanish families in Madrid. And then what you see is that this distribution is very similar to how different the children of families where children and parents separated for at least 3 months than when you compare them, and you compare them to those who never separated. So this kind of effect is basically explained by separation, right? And the way separation affects native children is very similar to the, it's very similar across like migrant status. So being separated from your parents like hurts you very similarly. I mean, so put it in other ways. In other words, being separated from your parents is a hurting experience, no matter whether you are a migrant or a native. But if you actually see the first plot only, or the first part of the story, before you fully control for other effects, you may end up saying very easily, oh, these children are like, you know, contextually discriminated or disadvantaged. I'm not saying they are not, but their mental well-being is basically explained by the processes that families follow to reunify or to migrate, no, family. And to you, Elu, which is the last question. Thanks. Well, my pleasure. I'll be glad to discuss with you and to discuss your qualitative study on Chinese families in Spain. And I'll be, of course, happy to deliver this data to you as well if you want to have a look at it. And as a conclusion of like this first bunch of questions, all the data that I'm using in these slides, of course, is like available for anyone, okay? And the papers, and I am, of course, happy to discuss with you any of these points, okay? Okay, so I'm moving forward. Let's cover each of these 5 solutions to 1 hour is gone already. Okay, so let's like let's start from the first one and hopefully arrive to the 5th one. The first one is, of course, like, it's just like common sense, no? But I'm happy covering it anyway. So the first solution is, of course, to estimate separate models for each of these like clusters or each of these contextual settings you are interested in studying, and it's probably the case of most qualitative research. No, they look at like people in this context, people in this other context, and they never put people together. No. So this is also like a very conventional comparative strategy in quantitative research. Regarding my first example on these 2 regions in PISA, like you can of course like estimate these 2 separate regression analysis, and you can plot like specific confidence intervals for each of them, and you can compare these 2, right, and see how the slopes and the constants are across these 2 like cases of interest, no? And if you estimate them separately, you will end up having like residuals that are nicely distributed randomly, but also with an average of 0, as you can see in this specific example. This is probably the most primitive kind of comparison between contexts, no? And this is probably the most simple comparative strategy in your migration research or in your research in general, no? So let me give you this example. So there's this idea in migration research that migration undermines human capital. So part of it is evaluated when you migrate, mostly because there are transaction costs associated to migration, including, for instance, like shocks or problems that you may confront, but also like the fact that part of the human capital that migrants accumulate, that we all accumulate, is specific of the setting in which you acquire it, right? And then, of course, there are like other aspects having to do with language, for instance, or any other thing that might actually hinder your ability to maximize the returns to your educational investment prior to migration. So the research question might be like, which are the migrant group that is more disadvantaged compared to natives when they want to get like returns to their education? Is it the most qualified migrants or the least qualified? There are reasons to suspect that both things happen, no? Like the least qualified migrants might have like a more context-specific kind of human capital, while the most qualified migrants might be more might be more likely to be subject to this kind of devaluation of their human capital. But specifically here is like, what if we are not only thinking about who is more disadvantaged or affected by migration in trying to get like a higher return to their human capital, but also where is this penalty larger? Think, for instance, of these three countries. These are just like the countries we studied in this EU funded project, Temper. I think Amparo Gonzalez was explaining to you this morning, right? So UK, Spain, and France. And have a look at, we were using PIAC data. I forgot to mention that. We were using PIAC data at the time to actually answer this question, right? And PIAC is a very nice, probably most of you know it, no? And it's part of the Ehtmig survey project. It's a very nice data set to study how migrants use their human capital and what kind of human capital they have in countries of destination, right? So now we see the data set in which you have like measures of cognitive competencies or skills for the adult population, and we have like nice samples of migrants and natives in all three countries of interest in this specific paper. So this is what happens in Spain. What this shows is that the dependent variable here is the probability of being unemployed, right? So there is, generally speaking, a negative correlation between the probability of being unemployed in Spain, in this case, right? And it applies both to migrants and natives. As you can see, the confidence intervals, this happens normally in this kind of surveys, is larger for migrants, because the sample is smaller and there's more uncertainty. It's like the distribution is tighter for natives. But what we see here is that the largest difference happens to take place among the most qualified migrants. The most qualified individuals. So those who are less able to actually, those migrants who are less able to maximize the returns to their educational investment are the most qualified. Okay, the most educated. And this happens regardless of whether you use like a qualitative a proxy for education or years of education. And so this is the picture for Spain. This is the picture for the UK. There's less unemployment in the UK than in Spain, as you all know. But the pattern is similar in the sense that it is only among the most qualified individuals in the sample, so the most educated ones, that we see the more significant difference with natives, right? So regardless of the fact that the context of unemployment in the UK and Spain is very different, we see that there is a very clear pattern that actually happens to be very similar to the Spanish one. No? So the two very different labor markets and a very similar pattern of disadvantage among migrants and natives when you try to see how they obtain returns to their education in terms of protecting themselves against unemployment. And interestingly, this is what happens in France. It's also among the most educated people where migrants are more different to natives, right? So again, a very different kind of context of labor market, but a very similar pattern. Okay, so this is a summary of what I just told you. These three countries are very different from each other, but there is at the individual level a very similar pattern of behavior. So I don't know how we can do that, but I was planning so that we can all participate. Planning to ask you if it, Sandy, if it doesn't work this way, or if it doesn't make sense, I can myself like proceed, like move on and explain the limitations to this approach. But if anyone wants to say or to argue which are the limitations of this approach, just raise your hand, and like, if not, I will like. I mean, I don't want to like break the rules. So if you did,
no, there are no rules. Don't worry.
So this is the kind of comparative, the basic kind of like more the simplest comparison between contexts. Okay, so to start with, when we use like when we use this approach, we're comparing, we are making comparisons within its context, right? We are comparing migrants and natives within its context. We're not comparing them across, right? So this is one of the main limitations of this context, of this approach. But the most important one, I think, is that you can only play in your data with explanations that happen to take place at the individual level. So you might be able to say, so migrants in Spain are this way or that way, or sorry, migrants in Europe are this way or that way, and you would only have like the right to argue at the individual level, but you will not be able to make claims empirically at the contextual level or at the level of your countries of study. Let me see.
Questions on the example.
So yeah, exactly. Mina is right in that if you pull these three countries together, then you can like specify the idiosyncratic component of context. You can absorb it in dummies and then interact them with your individual level explanations. Or you can, to some extent, even though you only have three cases, introduce contextual variables or institutional, so for instance, variables like variables that will capture the institutional setting in these different countries to see how your country dummies shrink. Okay, but this will be very risky and not very orthodox if you only have a small number of countries in your model. If you only have three, for instance, right? So indeed, Mina and Fatima are right. You can overcome this difficulty by pulling the data together. Exactly. You can of course like interact these country dummies with all your independent variables, and even though you can do that, you will never know which is the specific reason why in France or in Spain gender might be like more or less important. Okay. A ver, Charles. Maybe got their degrees from their countries of origin in certain cases, and in the countries of destination in other cases, or maybe exactly. So listen, Charles is, for instance, suggesting this effect that we observe in these three different countries might be due to different arguments, but the only possibility that you have in this research approach is to actually use individual level explanations. And then anything that is institutional and that will refer to how this is in the slope of the effects will have to be sent to the concluding section of your paper. And you will be invited probably by your reviewer to post, make an argument about why these three different countries are different. Okay, while the slope of the effects that we found is different across these different countries. So this is why one of the potential solutions Fatima and Mina were already suggesting so, is to put the data together and operate with a single data set in which you will have context modeled by a single, by a dummy for each country, right? Very briefly, let's first cover technically the solution, and then I'll give you an example. So dummies as fixed effects is okay if your focus is on within cluster variation, so within country variation, right? That was specifically the case of the previous example, but it will improve your ability to say how different contexts are. You can of course model very easily differences in the concept, in the constant and the slope, and you can actually play with your interactions to actually give some air to your data and allow for between country differences in how some of your independent variables work. This is the case I was using in my first example with regions in Spain. No? So if you run the more complex model that you can with this very simple example, so this is like the first region and the second region with the linear prediction of the PISA scores in mathematics, you will end up showing that pretty similar, the effect of parental education is pretty similar across these two regions, right? And you can compare it, you can compare the slope, and you can compare the constants. Let's have a look at the mental health issue among educational migrants. And I will here develop more in detail my argument about mental well-being and the measures that I used in this ongoing research. So a little bit of background. There's this idea that migrants are healthier in general, no? You probably heard it. The healthy immigrant paradox, which is a very trendy kind of topic in migration research and in integration research. But we know that there is one very, well, there are many exceptions to the rule that in general migrants are healthier. One of them is that migrants are more distressed, that they have like worse mental health, and they're more likely to actually suffer from a number of pathologies, psychiatric or psychological pathologies, including depression or anxiety or psychotic disorders even. And this is I would say an epidemiological regularity that has been documented in very many different countries. So the question is, what is it that creates this distress? There's like a lot of discussion about this like a specific regularity, no? Some people say that experiencing migration, I mean, it's like the most common it's the most common argument, no? That experiencing migration and the rupture that it conveys is very traumatic, and that migrants suffer from post-traumatic stress disorders and other sources of mental distress as a consequence of having experienced migration. But there's also a lot of discussion about context, like context and discrimination, pushing migrants to feel distressed for good reasons, of course. It's specifically the case among educational migrants, so international students, for instance, no? Who, I don't know, in your different countries and settings, I understand that you might like have heard of like suicides, and like in the UK it's a very popular topic. No? In the Times Higher Education has featured articles and evidence on these very recently and very constantly over the last years. So this connects with what I was just saying before at the beginning of my presentation, and then in the questions that you raised during the first break. Mental health is an essential integration outcome, I would suggest. I think it's like of great importance really to understand integration, to the extent that I would consider mental health as a prerequisite for successful integration. So you may have like very generous integration policies, or very sophisticated or developed integration policies. You may have like a lot of resources to actually help migrants in different settings to integrate. But if they don't have the kind of like mental stability that we all need to like succeed in life, or to actually do our own way in life, it's really difficult that we achieve the wanted level of integration. So this is what I just said before. How do we measure mental health? Of course, be aware that what we understand by mental health is a very culturally sensitive reality, right? So it might be different in different cultural contexts. But it's good that epidemiologists already did part of the job and of the work, and we have like some scales that actually help us to capture in different settings, or with probably with imperfections or imperfectly, but like generally correctly, in a correct manner, help us capture these dimensions of subjective well-being, which we would probably have to label modestly psychological distress, right? So Kessler 7 is one of these scales. It's a battery of 7 questions. There's like other batteries, also by Kessler 21 and more like detailed. K7 is enough, I think, for like this kind of like demoscopic or survey tools that we may need in our analysis, no? So it's a self-reported collection of data by individuals. I'll show you how it works, and producing a correct integration of the answers given to these different questions, to these 7 questions. You end up having a measure that is associated with distress, right? It's not pathologies, but it's like symptoms of distress. And this is the survey that I'm using in this analysis. This survey, I'm particularly proud of it, and there's a website for it, and we're constructing it and updating it, and we will actually make the data public to everyone very soon. It's a very large survey of Chinese students in the countries that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation: the UK, Germany, Japan, and China, right? We also have like samples of natives in Germany, UK, and Japan. So it's a pretty good instrument to actually explore the effects, some effects that international students reflect as a consequence of migration. Of course, the questionnaire were translated into these different languages, into the different languages of the population we surveyed, and it was done backwards and with a lot of rigor, I would say. So we're confident that we're capturing across these different countries the effects that we're interested in. And this is how these different populations look in our survey. So let me first of all cover the 7 dimensions Kessler suggests for measuring mental distress in the most synthetic battery of questions. So the version in which only 7 items are included. So Kessler asks, over the past 30 days, how often did you feel sad? Did you feel nervous? Did you feel restless, hopeless? Did you feel that everything you were doing was an effort? Did you feel worthless? Or did you feel lonely? And this is how, I don't know if you can see in your screens properly, this is how these different groups answered on average to our questions. So Chinese in the UK, Chinese in Germany, Chinese in China, and then 2 samples of natives in destination, Brits and Germans. There's one clear thing here, and it's that, you know, at first sight, everyone is similar. I mean, like the average answer given by these groups to our questions is pretty similar. So there are like no massive differences in how students behave in different countries. But then when you pull them together, well, what you see is that Chinese in the UK, Chinese in Germany, British and Germans are the most distressed. And Chinese in China are the least so. And this happens both at the undergraduate and the postgraduate level. So there is, although to some extent, you know, differences at the postgraduate level are less marked. So there's evidence to say that eventually Chinese migrants are more distressed than their colleagues in origin, so their peers can migrate. But it's also true that British and Chinese in Britain or in the UK are pretty similarly distressed, and Germans and Chinese in Germany are pretty similarly distressed. So there's like probably a lot of convergence, no? We can use like different independent variables to try to explain variation along this dependent variable. No? We can use like different predictors. So field of study is not probably as stressful to study sociology than if you do engineering. Now that we are like this, like probably friendly group to sociologists, no? But it's very stressful anyway, but less so. It's not as stressful to be a first student than to be in your final year. Your age might also like help you or provide you with some resources to cope with the stress. Females might be more distressed than males. This is also an epidemiological regularity that happens to take place everywhere in the world. So you have like many different explanations that actually happen to operate here at the individual level. Okay. Which are the limitations to this approach? So compared to the previous one, we here gain some potential to actually make cross-group comparisons. No? Like we have a single model, so we are probably entitled to actually make claims about how different individuals in different contexts are, how different individuals are in different contexts. But just as Patricia is saying, you risk having many hidden variables, no? Including those that relate to the context. There are many, of course, Patricia. There are many, but I'm particularly interested in thinking about those that are explaining why it is actually the case, for instance, that Chinese in the UK and British students are similarly stressed. There's something about the UK that is stressful, and it doesn't happen in China. And it doesn't happen, and this is probably why Chinese students who decided not to migrate are less distressed or less stressed than students in the UK, and the same happens for Germany. Kind of like argument applies for Germany. There's something about Germany that is probably distressing or stressing, that we cannot see, or that students in China do not suffer. Yes, give me a second. Patricia is reacting to my comment. In the meantime, so this is of course, yeah, yeah, exactly. Patricia is right in that RCTs eventually might help us to actually neutralize the effect of these hidden variables, but what we can never randomize, Patricia, you would agree with me, is the context, which is probably the source of these differences between students in different countries across migrant status. But I agree with you that generally speaking, this kind of hidden variables can be neutralized by looking or by using RCTs. And you can, of course, look at natural experiments. You know what we did in this paper? This paper is not published yet, but what we did was actually comparing in our sample the effect of the timing in which students responded to the survey. And it happened that across countries, the survey took so long for us to do that some of them responded at the time of exams. And that's like very close to a natural experiment, because you have like some individuals who are like in the valet type of period in which you can actually deal easily with stress, and then you have students who responded at the time of exams. So it's a sort of natural experiment, and you will if you're interested, I will send you the paper, Patricia. But the nice thing is that I believe that students are very similar in different countries. Sorry, within its countries. So Chinese students are more stressed when there's a period of exams and they happen to answer to the survey at that time, just as British, and they benefit from being more relaxed similarly, which is an option we never actually. I mean, it sounds very self-evident, but we migration scholars tend to force the idea that migrants are so different, and I believe this is why this paper, even though it happens to look at a very specific dependent variable on a very specific migrant population, I believe that the implications of this paper are like interesting for migration research in general, because it shows that migrants really adapt to the context in which they migrate, or at least highly educated migrants, as it is the case of these educational migrants, Chinese international students. Okay, I'm going to move forward to the third solution. So previously, we gained the possibility of establishing stable, robust, or reliable comparisons between our groups. These 5 groups that I spoke in this previous paper. But as I was saying before I engaged with Patricia in this short discussion, we don't know why is it the case that the UK is more stressing than China, or why is China less stressing than the UK and Germany? Particularly when you have like a population that in this global world is subject to similar constraints or like stressors, I assume that it's very stressing to be a student in China also, university student in China. It is also very stressing to be an international student in tertiary education in Europe. So why is it that? What is it that makes China less stressing, or what is it that makes Europe more stressing? So for that, we would actually want to control for contextual independent variables. So not only really like dummies that capture country effects, so we'll absorb everything that is specific about being in China or being in the UK or Germany, but you know, why countries are specifically different, no? And I will give you an example on perinatal health in Ecuador and Spain. So let me first go back to the example that I'm using to introduce all of these solutions, no? So my PISA example. One school, one observation per school. So the unit of analysis is schools, and we have all regions in Spain, right? So unlike in the previous examples in which I only had 2 regions, now I have like all regions in Spain. And instead of controlling for regions, instead of using like dummies and interacting these dummies with the individual level independent variables, I will use like aggregate level independent variables. So the average level of education, which is like a school level, this is like, so to say, the individual level independent variable that I was using before, so parental education, but then I will use like these 2 contextual variables, regional average or regional average performance, so how successful the region is, and also the percentage of GDP that is spent on education regionally, okay? And let's see how this helps. So this is the first model that I showed you from this is stat output, right? So it's just the same I showed you before. This is the case in which you have all independent, all cases. I have like almost like 900 cases. There's only one individual level independent variable. In this case, it's school level independent variable, which is parental education. So indeed, we know from before and from common sense that schools in which students higher levels of parental education cluster are more successful schools. And this is the problem that we had before, right? Here is just like these 2 regions shown, the ones that I used in my previous examples, but a cloud of dots is like more populated now because there are like many more schools in the sample. So the first model is the one that I was using in my previous slide. The second one is a model in which the average performance in mathematics is controlled for, and the level of spending in education is also controlled for. These 2 are like regional level independent variables, so contextual aggregate level independent variables. And as you can see, what is interesting is that these 2 variables help us to actually nicely solve part of the problem that we had before. This is the case in which we are not controlling for contextual independent variables. So we have the problem that we documented earlier this afternoon. There are 2 sets of schools that are clustered across these 2 regions that actually behave. It's not nice to have this like systematic trend of residuals corresponding to some region being above 0 and below 0 for the other, right? But when you control for these 2 regional variables that I just introduced here, so average level of mathematics in the region and spending, you actually solve the problem or almost solve it, right? You get rid of this annoyance. You don't need to control for dummies with all the regions, but you can control for the key aspects of the regional dimension that you think that explains why in some cases the schools over or underperform on average. Okay, so there's no need to actually, if you're working with all the countries in the world, or if you're working with all regions in a country, or with all schools in a given region, you don't need to have a dummy for each of them. You just actually have to identify the independent variables that you find most interesting or more potential, more powerful ex ante to account for the variation that you have in your independent variable, in your dependent variable, sorry. So let me give you an example of how this works. There's this paradox, no, that migrants are healthier across countries and across migrant destinations and across migrant origins than natives. No, this is an analysis of data I'm conducting with a colleague of mine, Leire Salazar, and this analysis owes her a lot. So the healthy immigrant paradox has been documented in many different settings, but very importantly in the US, having evidence, strong evidence, and like important statistical infrastructures that allow to identify how Mexican migrants behave from the point of view of health outcomes in the US, as well as in Mexico, in origin. No? So there are different explanations to this healthy immigrant paradox, but the most promising ones, I think, have to do with selection. So it is known by you guys who are like migration experts that migrants are thought to be different from natives in specific outcomes. No, for instance, in health, it's the strongest people or the healthiest people that might be more likely to migrate, and those who stayed are probably not unhealthy, but less healthy than those who migrate. And there's also like this second selection, which is the Salmon bias. No, those who return are more likely to be less healthy. So you might go back to Mexico to die, for instance, or because you feel unwell, I don't know. So there's like a double selection of those who stay in the US, those Mexicans who stay in the US, and this might explain why they systematically behave as I am predicting. No, they are healthier. No, and there's a lot of discussion about positive selection in health. But I think that one of the most promising independent variables or stages of life to measure this healthy immigrant paradox is the moment of birth, because it is really there when the strength or the health of mothers actually be directly transmitted to the children to show, or to give like a push to show like, or to give them like better health outcomes. No. So I will try to isolate the effect of migration comparing Spanish mothers, children born to Spanish mothers, children born to Italian mothers in Spain and also in Ecuador. And to do this paper, in which we are currently working still, we did like a massive, it was really painful. Like we put together, like we pulled data from like the birth statistics in Spain and Ecuador. It's a similar register. So this is registered data. It's the universe that we are working with. And we excluded multiple and stillbirths. And of course, we don't need a probabilistic frame because we have like the universe of cases. No, we have many different independent variables. Unfortunately, we don't have what we wish we have. No, like for instance, mother lifestyle or measures of mother health. We can only control for mother's characteristics. We can control for education, whether the mother is older than 35, which is an old mother for epidemiologists. The number of children she had before this specific birth, her civil status, and for the child, we can control the migrant mother, the migrant status, the father migrant status. The baby is a female, because female are lighter. The key dependent variable that we want to work with is weight at birth, which is standard. No, weight at birth both as a continuous variable, so healthier babies are heavier. Also, avoidance of low birth weight, and low birth weight is babies weighing less than 2,500 grams. So have a look at this first plot. I want to get your views, and this way I will benefit from your feedback if it comes to me. So in white you have the weight distribution of babies born to Ecuadorian mothers in Spain, and in pink you have the distribution of weights of Ecuadorian mothers in Ecuador. So in pink you have non-migrants, and in white you have Ecuadorian migrants. We're comparing these two populations, okay? And it's interesting to see, you would agree with me, in general, what we see is that the distribution of weight at birth for Ecuadorian migrants is displaced towards healthier weights, so heavier babies. While for natives, it is, you know, more inclined, or it starts, and the density of cases points at a higher likelihood of having lighter babies. So anyone wants to react to this? Any critic? Why might this be the case? It is migrant selection. Patricia.
Okay, I'm just going to say, I think you need to consider the contextual facts. So, for example, poverty rates in Ecuador, inequality rates in Ecuador, and also health indicators of Ecuador that tend to be lower than health indicators in the UK. So in the UK, you have like the public system. There is one of the best in the world. So probably those mothers, they also had better, I don't know, prenatal care than Ecuadorian mothers in rural areas of Ecuador. So I think you need to consider these contextual facts of these indicators of the countries as well.
Exactly. So, Patricia, I agree again with you strongly. This other plot overlaps the distribution of weights with babies born to Spanish mothers. So what you see is that systematically, of course, comparing babies in Spain and Ecuador, we have like heavier babies in Spain than Ecuador, probably because of poverty rates. Just by making these kind of claims, we're not moving forward compared to the previous solution, in which we had like dummy variables, right? We can say, oh, in general in Spain, people are like, mothers have heavier babies because there are like lower poverty rates than in Ecuador. But think of, for instance, trying to find a proxy that will help you to control for the quality of the healthcare. Okay, and this is what we did. This specific paper, instead of controlling for like the dummies, no, we have for the country dummies, we have like regions across both countries, and regions are very different internally, of course in Spain, but most importantly in Ecuador. And if we want to look for a context variable that will proxy access for and the quality of healthcare, we can think of different variables. We thought of two specific ones. One is the percentage of deaths that happened in each of these regions, so in across regions in Ecuador and Spain, that were due to diabetes. So diabetes is this kind of illness that you need to take a good control over time, right? So you really need a healthcare system that is helping you over time, right? It's a condition that can create problems for you in the long run, but you have to take care of since the beginning, right? So monitoring the progress of your indicators is important, and behaving accordingly, and someone helping you out is important. And of course, this is easier in countries that have like more developed healthcare systems. Alternatively, we thought of the percentage of deaths by septicemia. I think this is how it is pronounced in English. Sorry, that I think it's the first time that I pronounce this word so far since we are doing this paper. So septicemia is this kind of blood poisoning, right? So as far as you have like, you're at the risk of blood poisoning, it can happen to you that you can die immediately, right? So you need a healthcare system that actually helps you very fast. Otherwise, you can have like problems, right, in the short run. He's asking about percentage of maternal mortality. So this only births, Patricia, that happen to be like alive babies and mothers, right? So stillbirths are not considered. Problematic births are excluded from the analysis. There's of course a selection bias into this kind of outcomes. We control for differently, but the way these two conditions at birth are registered in Ecuador and Spain are not making it comparable. Okay, so it would be a great. I see what you mean. You mean like percentage of maternal mortality as a proxy of healthcare. Very smart. Yeah, it will help. It will very nicely complement. Nice. I mean, we'll try to look at it. Thank you, Patricia. So have a look at this. This is like regions in Spain and Ecuador, and this is the percentage of people who die from septicemia and percentage of people who die from diabetes. But then in red you have like regions in Ecuador. In blue you have regions in Spain. And what you see here is that both can help proxy what we want to proxy, which is like the quality of the healthcare system in origin, but probably septicemia will help us better, no? Because there is more variation across regions than if you look at diabetes, right? So this is basically what we did in this paper, right? We introduced this control. I'm skipping the results. You will get the results. It's here, no? You will get the results, get my slides, and you can comment on them if you would like. I would be happy to discuss them with you. But what we see generally is that Ecuadorian natives and Spanish natives, to some extent as well, have a higher probability of having babies that are considered low birth weight than Ecuadorian migrants. No? So this proxy is helping us so far to get rid of the annoying comments by reviewers. And our data is, Patricia, our data is 2018. Our data is 2018. We are now working with data starting from 2000, and we're pulling them together because Ecuadorian migration in Spain was among the Ecuadorians in Spain were among the first flow to arrive, right? So, but the last year we have is 2018. Okay, so I'm moving forward. This approach allows us to properly control for contextual effects, but it does not allow to fully neutralize the effect of context. Okay, Santi, I think you are like popping up for some reason. No, you want to?
No. Just to say that yeah, we have 15 minutes to go.
I know.
Yeah. So no, I didn't want to, because the idea also, the cost action organization asked me that we should try at the end of this presentation to make a group photograph. So with as many participants as possible switching on their cameras and then get an image. But that basically what I'm saying is you have 10 minutes.
I know, it's very unfortunate.
For the two examples that you have, and then maybe collect one or two questions.
I mean, I'm collecting questions. So, yeah, I have like 2 sets of slides to go. I'll try to speed up. Of course, I will make this presentation available to everyone, as well as the papers that and I can discuss with you individually if you want, because sorry that I didn't realize time was flying. Paul is asking with weight instead of health. You may as well be measuring race. Very smart. Maybe relevant in the case of Ecuador. This is a very smart comment, Paul. We cannot cope with that. It's really, there's a lot of anthropometry ongoing in accounting for differences in birth weight in Ecuador. But These differences relate mostly to weight and not to height, because it seems that babies are like very similar at birth. Babies are very similar across, and this 2,500 grams benchmark, it's an World Health Organization pattern. So I think Patricia is pointing at the same kind of argument. So yeah, I think you are right? I'm moving forward. So my point was that this solution, which is probably more sophisticated and more parsimonious and more to the point than the previous ones, that does not allow to fully control for context. So the nicest solution, if you really want to actually neutralize cross-country variation or between clusters or between aggregate level of an analysis in your research, is to actually go for fixed effects modeling. Fixed effects modeling is like basically like incorporating in your model dummies for every country that you are interested in, right? Or for every country contributes to your data set. This is the output of a very. Well, I'm going to skip this. I'm going right to the point of my presentation. So I'm going to show you how this can be done using this example of where to migrate. So there are two kinds of arguments. One is that migrants go there where they can obtain the highest returns to their human capital, to their education, for instance, as I said before. And also the idea migrants might prefer settings in which the welfare configuration is generous. No? But if you think of highly qualified migrants, people tend to think that yes, they are interested in choosing destinations that where returns to human capital are higher, but also they are disincentivized by welfare magnets, so by generous welfare states. Allow me to skip the framework, right? So it's just the idea that I mentioned before. So migrants would be in general income maximizers. So they would go there where they would be higher paid, and this is how they maximize returns to education. And they have also, for instance, a lower probability of being unemployed, etc., or being on temporal employment. But highly skilled migrants would actually be not very inclined to go there where the state provides a lot of care. They don't want to pay with their taxes other people's welfare, right? This is the idea. So to explore whether this is the case, we use data from the European Labour Force Survey, and we actually managed to construct a dependent variable that is the number of students of highly skilled migrants that arrived in each European country every year. And we got different contextual variables from the OECD, right? And what we did was estimating fixed effects that neutralized country differences. I would only look at differences in the contextual predictors within its country, okay? So what did we see? What we saw was that migrants whose migration horizon, so their migration plan was shorter, so migrants that would only stay for, say, 1 year, are in generally very disincentivized to choose European countries where taxes are higher, okay? They would, in general, choose countries where salaries are higher. They would avoid countries where unemployment is higher. They would avoid, particularly, countries in which fiscal pressure is higher. So this really fits the idea that highly skilled migrants are income maximizers. But But if you look at migrants whose time horizon is more long-term, so migrants who are not staying only for 1 year, but migrants who are at least staying for 5 years. So migrants that we observe in the data 5 years after their arrival, what we see is that indeed they want to go to countries where wages are higher. They want to avoid countries where unemployment is higher, but they are not disincentivized by fiscal pressure. And in fact, they want, in preference, countries where spending in welfare is higher. Okay? So there is a lot of selection, not only from origin into migration, but there is also massive selection of migrants by profile into different destinations. So the sorting of migrants across different destinations plays a role that we tend to ignore when we do migration research, or that sometimes migration research ignores. I think it's a little bit unfair to depict highly skilled migrants as income maximizers, as sharks that only look for their own interest. Migrants, even including those who are highly skilled, are not necessarily disincentivized by generous welfare configurations, and it might eventually be happy to migrate to countries in which there is like more spending and even higher fiscal pressure. So this approach neutralizes between country variation and help us concentrate on changes across countries and individual level dynamics. The problem with this kind of fixed effects approach is that it doesn't allow your independent variables to have a different effect across countries. So, sorry, within its, or across countries, yeah, exactly. So fixed effects does not really allow for a proper estimation of how different gender plays, how differently gender plays a role in different countries. I had my last solution, which is multi-level modeling, but it's 5:26. Santi, should I proceed or just leave this to everyone in my slides? I don't know. I didn't manage time as I expected, and I thought that this would make it to 5:30, but I am still lagging behind. So
I don't know. Can you just
Eva is, thank you, Patricia. Eva is suggesting that we take a photo and then everyone can leave, and those who want to stay can just I'll take only 5 minutes probably. I mean,
okay.
Fatima,
wants to see the solution. So
what if we take the picture now and we
No. Go for it, and then we take the picture.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So multi-level model. This is very unfortunate, but this is really my I would say my skill. No, I invested a lot of time in studying multi-level modeling. For modeling context and for studying context in migration research. So I'll go for a very quick overview of multi-level modeling. This is really a challenge, no? 3 minutes and I'll be explaining this kind of. Okay, so this is one level independent variable. Sorry, a one level equation, right? So a single, the kind of regression analysis we normally do. And this is the kind of distribution of errors when we only have one level of analysis. So we have one single constant plus an error term, and we have our constant and observations being distributed above and below that average. This is how we work, no, in migration. And errors is defined as the distance between these observations and the constant. But then sometimes it is the case that these observations are clustered, and in that case, this type of solution is not the most appropriate one, because we are ignoring the clustering of students, of cases in our data set. And when this is the case, we have a different specification of our equations than when we have one level. So one level is just one constant plus an error term. When we have two levels, we have like a constant that applies to everyone, okay, plus a specific constant for each group that would actually show us whether the group as a whole differs from the average, general average, okay? And then we have, of course, within each group, an error term, okay? And if you got this set of slides, you just got multi-level regression analysis. Multi-level regression analysis, I mean, people make a lot of noise about it, but it is just a regression in which there are two types of constants, one for all and one for each group, full stop. In the most complex versions of it, there's one slope for all and one slope for each group. That's it. That's everything multi-level does for us, okay? So, this is basically what I was saying. I'm going to show you just an example in which I tried to model the decision to migrate with my China data, okay, the data that we did in these different countries. Sorry, with my China data from the China Family Panel Study. Like I'm in such a hurry that I'm starting to say nonsenses. So this is a paper in which we explore who decides to go abroad for education, right? Who decides to be an educational migrant. So there are different arguments, no? Like some people think like only the elite goes abroad to study, but there's another increasingly important variable that says, listen, in this global world, it's not only the elite that goes abroad for education. Being global is increasingly democratic. More and more people are starting to move around, including moving around for education, regardless of their elite status, right? And this is what we were studying in this paper. And as you can see, there are signs to suspect that it might be the case. So in the China Family Panel Study, 3 in 4 students are not moving and are studying in China. Sorry, are planning to study in China. So 3 in 4 are planning to study in China. And 1 out of 4 are considering the possibility of moving abroad, okay? So we are doing an analysis. I'm not going to show you. I'm just going to show you the constants for each region in China. In studying this variation, so in studying who is considering the possibility of migrating for education in China, there is a single constant that will apply to the model as a whole, okay? So around 15% of the students in China, this is where the constant, so around 25% of the students in China are considering studying abroad. But this applies to China as a whole. Then there are regions where students are much more likely to be considering migrating for their education than in others, right? For instance, look at how the general constant for China is corrected by students in Shanghai. So students in Shanghai are the ones that are more likely to report that they are considering migrating. And this is it. I mean, this is what multi-level regression does. There's like a constant for everyone, and then every region in China has its own constant. Students in Guangdong, Guizhou, and Sichuan are less likely to be considering migrating for their education than students in Shanghai, Chongqing, and Beijing. And this is how we should think about multi-level regression. Just the final claim. The nice thing about multi-level is that it not only helps you, or it not only allows for you, and I promise I finish with this, it not only allows you to correct the constant for every student in different regions, in your clusters, in your provinces, in your countries, etc. It not only helps you to actually give more air to reality, for your data to adjust to reality. It also helps you to explain why these different regions are different from the average in China, right? This is the average, and this is how different regions are in the likelihood of students considering to move abroad for their education. You can use specific independent variables to account for this between region variation. And the kind of argument we made in this paper is that students in regions that are more exposed to the transnational are indeed more likely to say that they want to migrate. It's not only an elite behavior, because there are regions like Shanghai where you are global by definition. You are exposed to globalization. You are exposed to like big chains, to Netflix, to everything. I mean, more so than in other regions. So 1 second and I finish. In this paper, what we did was like measuring the exposure to the transnational, gathering data on how different provinces in China are in terms of the number of visitors they got from the foreign visitors that they get, the number of broadband subscribers to the internet, the number of websites based in the region, the total value of import and exports in international trade, and the total investment, direct investment from foreign enterprises. And what you can see is that it is indeed the case that in blue you have the bars that correspond to the less exposed to the transnational regions. Children of families who are in these regions that are less globalized are reproducing the pattern according to which it is more likely for university students to go, children of university parents to go abroad. So in regions that are less global, there is indeed the idea that it is an elite behavior. It's mostly the children of parents with tertiary education that want to go abroad. But in regions that are more exposed to the transnational, and this is the orange bars, there's much more similarity across levels of parental background, okay? So this regional variation that we saw is basically explained by how global regions are. Okay, I hope that you can get this last point from my slides, and I will of course be happy to discuss them with you. Fatima, thank you for. Fatima was suggesting that we could take more hours for this session. I would be glad to do so. I hope that you can that we can see each other and discuss any other time with, and I promise to be less ambitious. Okay. So that's it, Santi. Thank you. Thank you for even for these 7 minutes I took extra.